this video lesson. It's not really a lesson, it's just basically a summary of all the type of equations that you get through grade 8 up until grade 11 basically, and then obviously using them all in grade 12. So the types of equations that we get is linear, then we get exponential, we get simultaneous, we get literal, and we get quadratic. Now linear, if we start off with linear, linear you've done since grade 8, and it looks as follows. So it can start very simple, or it can have brackets where you just have to multiply out the brackets, or it can start with fractions where you have to first get the lowest common denominator and then get rid of the fractions. But in any case, it only has one solution, and basically after you multiply it out the brackets or got rid of the fractions, all your terms that contain the variable or x goes to the one side, all the constants go to the other side, and then you simplify, divide, and you get your solution. Alright, then the exponential, that you roughly start in with grade 9, and very basic exponential equations in grade 9, but then as you progress, grade 10 they get a bit more complicated, and in grade 11 they get a bit more complicated. This one is like a basic one, where you always focus on getting the same bases. So for example, when we calculate this, 81 would have a base of 3, I think 3 to the power of 4, and 243 should also be able to prime factorize into a base of 3. Then when your bases are the same, you just drop the bases and then you equate, then it becomes a linear equation basically. There's that one. And then in grade 11 you also get one that is in quadratic form, where you actually have to apply quadratic factorization. They're not quite easy. They take a bit of practice, but yeah, there are those. Then simultaneous. Now we started with simultaneous equations in grade 10, and they require you to solve for x and y simultaneously, or for q and p, whatever the variables are. But in grade 10 you only get two linear equations where you have to apply simultaneous equations, and there's two methods. You can either use substitution or you can use elimination, those two methods. But then in grade 11 you get a linear and a quadratic equation together, and what happens here is you can actually apply it more practically in functions, where you have a linear graph and a straight line and a quadratic function, and you have to get the points of intersection between the two graphs. Then basically you just do simultaneous equations on those equations or functions. Right, so then we also get these type that are like an exponential. So it's not really always set in stone that is linear and quadratic. You can sometimes in your algebra questions get one that's quadratic and maybe a circle or whatever. Okay, and then we get literal equations. So literal equations are just a bunch of unknown variables. Normally when you have real life formulas, especially science formulas, that you have to the value of many of these variables, but then you have to solve for one of the unknown variables. And here you will just apply your basic maths manipulation rules. If you have something that's divided and you need to get rid of that, you multiply both sides. If you have something that's added, you need to get rid of that, you subtract both sides, and so on. Alright, and then finally quadratic. Now quadratic equations in itself has a few different methods as well. So first of all, there's the basic ones where you just get it in its standard form and you factorize and then you solve. So then when you factorize this, you get two terms, or two factors actually, two brackets, and you have to say this bracket equals to 0, or that bracket equals to 0, and then solve for a linear equation. It can start off a bit more complicated, where it starts off with fractions, and then you first have to find the lowest common denominator and put it into its standard form, and then you are ready to factorize and solve. Okay, then you can solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So there's a lesson on that, where you use the methods of completing the square to solve for that. And then there is the formula. Very popular using the formula, because if your quadratic equation can't factorize, then you'll need to substitute it into the formula. You can actually substitute anyone in the formula, whether they can factorize or not. It will give you your answers. Yeah, the formula is actually available on your formula sheet in grade 12, but in grade 11 you still need to know it off by heart. Alright, then you get squaring both sides. Oh, and just another thing before we go on, to look out for also in your exams, when they say solve this quadratic equation and leave your answer to the nearest 2 decimal places or 1 decimal place, you know immediately, okay, I need to use the formula here because it's going to leave decimal places, and then it doesn't have like integer roots, which means, or then it means that it wouldn't be able to factorize. Okay, going on now, squaring both sides isn't actually like an official method, but it's something to look out for. If you see this sum, for example, and you see there's a square root, a random square root in here, basically your first thought should be like square both sides, because we always do the opposite operation to get rid of or to get to x. But obviously first we'll take the 2 over and then we square both sides and work from there. We'll then get the quadratic equation in its standard form. Okay, and then also the flip side of that one would be square rooting both sides. When you have something that's squared, there's 2 ways to solve this actually. You can multiply out this bracket, and you can put the equation in its standard form and then go back and factorize it. But it's actually easier, less steps to just solve from here, taking square root of both sides, then taking the 3 over, then dividing by 2 and getting your answer like that. Okay, and then finally there's the K method. Now the K method is a way to simplify things. We can see this is quite a complicated sum, and what we can also see is that all the variables actually form a similar pattern. Basically we've got p squared plus 5 and p squared plus 5. So we can actually take that and just replace it with k. Then we can solve the equation. Then it would be a much simpler equation to solve in terms of k. And once you have k's value, you can just equate p squared plus 5p equals to the value of k and solve for p from there. So instead of having a very large sum, because I think this one might actually have 4 roots that comes out. Alright, so that is basically a summary of all the types of equations and that we use, and equations is something you use everywhere in maths. Almost every single section in maths you apply equations to it. So it's quite important to actually get the hang of this whole section.